Night 9 of the relentless storm. No roads, no sun, and no sound except the bitter mountain wind tearing across raw sandstone cliffs. Down on the floor of Stone Creek Valley, every traditional log cabin had gone dark, their chimneys choked with ice or cold from exhausted wood piles. Every hearth was silent, except one. High up on a vertical wall of rock, where no reasonable settler believed a human being could survive the season, smoke was still rising. It was thin, steady, and seemingly impossible. 3 weeks earlier, that very same structure had been the laughingstock of the entire settlement. Neighbors crossed themselves when they passed beneath the cliff. Parents warned their children not to stare at the eccentric stonemason cutting into the mountain face. Some claimed he had lost his mind. Others whispered that he was digging his own grave and calling it a home. He never defended himself. Not once. He simply kept swinging his hammer and chisel, cutting 16 feet deep into solid sandstone, choosing a cliff face that every other settler had cursed for blocking a wagon trail. And then the storm hit 9 days of Arctic cold that local records describe as the kind of weather that stops a man's breath before it stops his heart. It brought snow that felt less like winter weather and more like a physical assault, along with a howling wind that found every crack in every timber wall in the valley except his. What he understood about that mountain wall, almost no one else in the region did. It was not luck, and it was not magic. It was a secret hidden in the physics of the stone itself, something the rest of the valley had been standing on top of for years, without ever asking why it mattered. Inside his rock-cut chamber, while wind chills outside dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature sat at a steady, bone-warming 70 degrees Fahrenheit. He was not burning piles of wood around the clock. He burned a modest fire in the evening, relying on the mountain itself to do the heavy lifting. Before we step into the heart of this relentless storm and examine how this man outsmarted an entire valley, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from and what the coldest winter temperature is in your neck of the woods right now. Because what happened next in Stone Creek Valley is the part nobody expected, and it proves that the smartest solution is often sitting right under our feet. To truly understand what Ezra Caldwell built, picture Stone Creek Valley in the autumn of 1881. The settlement sat high in the Rockies at nearly 8,200 feet above sea level, ringed by jagged granite peaks that held snowpack for 9 months out of the year. The valley took its name from a narrow, swift-running creek fed by glacial meltwater that ran through its center. By October of 1881, 11 families called Stone Creek home. Every single one of those families had built their homes using the exact same methods passed down from their fathers and grandfathers. They felled lodgepole pines, squared the logs with broadaxes, stacked them into 4 rectangular walls, packed the seams with mud and straw chinking, and erected a single riverstone hearth against an interior wall. It was a building method that had survived for generations, not because it was energy efficient, but because it was familiar. It gave settlers a sense of comfort to see a traditional wooden house rising above the dirt. Into this isolated valley came a 38-year-old stonemason named Ezra Caldwell. Caldwell arrived alone, driving a heavy wooden wagon loaded not with comfortable furniture or homesteading supplies, but with a massive collection of iron hammers, steel chisels, stone wedges, and measuring lines. What raised eyebrows immediately was what Caldwell did, or rather did not do, during his first 11 days in the valley. He did not clear timber. He did not mark off a flat plot of land on the fertile valley floor near the creek. Instead, he spent nearly 2 weeks walking the eastern perimeter of the valley, climbing the base of a massive 60-foot sandstone cliff face. Witnesses observed him running his bare palms across exposed rock formations, tapping different sections with a small iron hammer, and leaning his ear against the stone to listen to the ringing tone produced by the strike. The other settlers watched him from a distance and assumed he was either a confused prospector looking for gold or a man who had lost his sanity on the trail. But Caldwell was doing something far more calculated. He was surveying a massive wall of dense sandstone that faced south-southeast, a wall that captured the very first hour of direct morning sunlight and held the last lingering rays of evening light before the sun dipped behind the Pride. Western Ridge. While the rest of the valley saw the cliff face as a cold, barren obstacle that blocked expansion, Caldwell saw an indestructible structural shell that had been absorbing solar energy for 10,000 years. When Caldwell finally began construction in late August of 1881, he did not pick up an axe. He picked up a 4-pound steel hammer and a cold chisel and began cutting directly into the base of the sandstone cliff. For nearly 4 months, through the blistering heat of late summer and the bitter morning frosts of October, the rhythmic ringing of Caldwell's hammer echoed down the valley from dawn until dusk. Working entirely alone, he widened a natural recession in the rock, excavating a living chamber 16 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet high directly out of the mountain face. No settler in Stone Creek had ever seen a human being build a dwelling this way. It was completely alien to Anglo-Saxon frontier traditions. While Caldwell would later write in a private letter that he had spent 2 seasons as a younger man observing earth-sheltered pit houses used by indigenous tribes further north, his design in Stone Creek was an original fusion of ancient thermal principles and precise stonemasonry. He kept his logic to himself. He never offered explanations to the settlers who rode by to gawk at him. He simply kept measuring, kept cutting, and kept choosing raw rock over timber in a region where timber was the only building material anyone trusted. By early November, as the first light dustings of snow began to coat the high ridges, the settlers on the valley floor were putting the finishing touches on their homesteads. Their squared log cabins stood neat and square, sealed tight with clay chinking, with smoke curling lazily from their stone chimneys. Ezra Caldwell's structure, by contrast, looked like an unfinished cave. 3 of its walls were raw, exposed sandstone, and the front opening remained partially framework, open to the cold canyon gales that swept through the pass at 30 to 40 miles per hour. To any conventional builder standing in the valley, Caldwell looked like a man who had made a fatal miscalculation, a fool who would freeze to death long before Christmas. By mid-November, Stone Creek Valley had rendered its final judgment on Ezra Caldwell, and it was not kind. Word traveled quickly among the 11 homesteading families. A prominent settler named Hollis, a farmer, who held considerable influence in the local community, was overheard at the trading post declaring that Caldwell was digging his own grave and calling it a house. The phrase spread like wildfire. It was repeated over Sunday meals, echoed at the supply store, and whispered among neighbor women until it transformed from a casual insult into an accepted fact. The objections raised by the settlers were grounded in what they believed was sound, practical frontier logic. A home cut into solid rock, they argued, would act like an underground cistern. When the spring thaw arrived, water would seep through the stone fractures and drown the living space. They claimed the chamber would trap damp, stagnant air, creating a breeding ground for respiratory sickness and lung rot. It would have no natural light, no proper ventilation, and if the cliff face ever shifted during an earth tremor, it would turn into an instant stone tomb. One settler's wife went so far as to forbid her children from walking anywhere near the eastern cliff face, describing Caldwell's excavation as an unholy pit that no civilized Christian family should ever lay eyes on. Underneath these practical complaints lay a deeper, more uncomfortable social reality that frontier oral history hints at. Caldwell had violated the sacred communal code of the western frontier. In isolated mountain settlements, survival depended on community cohesion. When a new family arrived, the valley gathered for a house raising. Men worked side by side to notch logs and lift heavy roof trusses, while women cooked communal meals. It was a ritual that forged bonds of mutual dependence. By building completely alone, by rejecting timber, and by choosing to sink his home into a mountain rather than raising a cabin on the valley floor, Caldwell had quietly communicated that he did not need his neighbors. He had rejected the fundamental assumption that frontier survival required everyone to live the exact same way. So, the valley turned his choice into a moral failure. They convinced themselves that his project was an act of arrogance, destined for tragic failure. Caldwell remained completely silent in the face of this social isolation. In one surviving fragment of a letter, he he wrote to his sister in Pennsylvania around this time. He penned a single sentence that captured his mindset. "They ask me why I cut into stone, and I ask them why they put their faith in wood that rots in a decade and burns to ash in an hour." It was not a hostile argument. It was a fundamental question of physics that no one else in the valley had the foresight to consider. Winter arrived early and hard in 1881. By the final week of November, nighttime temperatures at 8,200 feet dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Local weather notes mention an early cold snap that pushed the thermometer down to 15 below zero before sunrise. Down on the valley floor, the flaws of traditional log cabin construction were immediately laid bare. Even though log walls insulated against immediate wind, they possessed almost zero thermal mass. Wood can slow down heat transfer, but it cannot store heat energy. The moment a hearth fire died down to coals, the warm air inside the cabin escaped through the roof and walls, and the room cooled down instantly. To combat this constant heat drain, every family in Stone Creek was forced to burn firewood around the clock. Men and older boys spent 2 hours every morning out in the freezing air, splitting hard pine logs and dragging heavy sleds through the drifts. Families reported burning through nearly a full cord of firewood every 10 days just to keep a single room livable. Meanwhile, high on the cliff face, Caldwell had finally sealed his front wall. He built a thick facade using heavy pine beams and hand-cut sandstone blocks, leaving space for a thick oak door and 2 narrow vertical window openings aligned to catch the low winter sun. From the valley floor, his home looked like a small wooden shield pressed flat against the base of a giant rock wall. It was completely unremarkable, except for the fact that 3 of its 4 walls were made of 60-million-year-old sandstone that stretched hundreds of feet into the mountain behind it. The valley had already decided that Ezra Caldwell was a madman. They were about to discover that he was the only man in Stone Creek who actually understood how to survive. To understand why Caldwell's cliff chamber performed so brilliantly, you have to examine those 11 days he spent walking the rock face with his iron hammer. That surveying work was the true engineering foundation of the entire shelter. Geological surveys conducted in the region decades later confirmed that the eastern cliff of Stone Creek Valley consisted of a specialized, highly dense sandstone formation interbedded with quartz veins. Not all rock formations behave the same way when subjected to heat. Sandstone possesses an exceptionally high thermal mass for a sedimentary stone. This means it can absorb an immense quantity of British thermal units or heat energy before its internal temperature rises even a single degree. More importantly, once sandstone is saturated with heat, it releases that energy back into its environment at a remarkably slow, predictable rate over many hours. When Caldwell tapped the cliff face with his hammer, he was not checking for gold or structural cracks. He was testing the rock's acoustic density. A hollow, ringing tone indicated air pockets, shale fractures, or porous rock that would leak air and allow groundwater to seep through. A dull, solid thud indicated dense, heavy stone with high mass, a solid mineral mass, capable of storing and conducting thermal energy predictably. Furthermore, his choice of a south-southeast orientation was a masterclass in passive solar design. In the high Rockies during November and December, the sun rises late and sits extremely low on the southern horizon. Caldwell's sandstone wall caught direct sunlight for roughly 6 to 7 hours every day, even in the dead of winter. From 7:30 in the morning until mid-afternoon, solar radiation beat directly against the exposed stone face above his dwelling. Even on days when the air temperature sat at 10 degrees above zero, the dark sandstone absorbed millions of BTUs of solar heat. The mountain was acting as a massive solar collector, constantly recharging its internal thermal bank regardless of whether Caldwell built a fire inside or not. Compare this to the log cabins on the valley floor. A 10-inch pine log wall has an R value of roughly 1.5 per inch, but its thermal storage capacity is practically non-existent. Wood holds heat for minutes. Dense sandstone holds heat for days. While the log cabins lost their interior warmth the second their hearths flickered out, Caldwell's rear and side walls consisted of solid sandstone that stretched indefinitely into the earth. Once that rock mass reached a stable baseline temperature, it functioned less like a cold wall and more like an enormous radiant heater that never shut off. Caldwell had studied root cellars and deep spring houses across the frontier before moving to Montana. He had observed that farmers could store potatoes underground all winter without them ever freezing, even when air temperatures above ground dropped to 30 below zero. The ground below the frost line held a constant baseline temperature of 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Caldwell simply asked himself the ultimate survival question. If the earth could keep a potato from freezing all winter without a fire, what could it do for a human being who built his living room inside it? The valley settlers mocked him because they saw rock as a cold, dead substance. What they failed to grasp was that Caldwell had not chosen rock instead of a hearth. He had turned the entire mountain into a second hearth, a massive heat battery that required no splitting, no hauling, and no endless feeding. If the sandstone mountain was the battery, the custom hearth Caldwell constructed inside the chamber was the charging mechanism that brought the system to life. This was where his skill as a stonemason elevated the shelter from a simple cave into a brilliant piece of thermal engineering. Instead of building a conventional fireplace against an interior wooden wall, where half the heat escaped up the chimney pipe and out into the open air, Caldwell carved his hearth directly into the solid sandstone back wall, recessing the firebox 2 feet deep into the rock face itself. He lined the interior firebox with flat shale stones set in a specialized mortar. The chimney flue did not run straight up a short pipe. It snaked upward through nearly 4 feet of solid stone before venting out a small opening on a rocky ledge above the cliff. This created a primitive version of what modern off-grid builders call a masonry heater or thermal mass stove. When a fire burned in Caldwell's recessed hearth, the heat did not simply rise and float out into the room air. The intense thermal energy generated by the flames was driven directly into the solid sandstone surrounding the firebox through conduction. Just like a heavy cast-iron skillet absorbing heat on a stove burner, the sandstone wall slowly absorbed the fire's intensity. Hours after the fire had completely burned down to gray ashes, the stone wall continued to radiate gentle, deep infrared heat outward into the living chamber. Modern oral history accounts from descendants of the Valley record that visitors who stepped into stone chambers built on Caldwell's design decades later were stunned to touch the back wall and find it as warm as fresh-baked bread hours after any flame had died out. Caldwell also solved the air circulation problem using passive convection currents. He cut 2 narrow, vertical window openings at floor level on the front wooden facade and carved a small 4-inch round vent high up in the stone near the top of the arch. This created a natural airflow loop. Cold, dense air was drawn in low near the floor, passed over the warm flagstone floor, absorbed heat as it rose along the heated sandstone rear wall, and slowly circulated through the chamber before venting stale moisture out through the high stone port. It was a completely passive, draft-free ventilation system that kept the living space fresh, dry, and free of the damp mold that his neighbors had predicted. To insulate his living space from the ground, Caldwell laid a 4-inch bed of dry, washed river gravel across the excavated earth floor, then capped it with broad, flat sandstone slabs. The gravel layer broke the capillary draw of soil moisture and prevented cold ground temperatures from pulling heat out of the flagstones. When radiant heat from the rear wall swept across the room, the stone floor absorbed that warmth, keeping the floor comfortable enough to walk on in wool socks. Along the northern wall of the chamber, opposite the front entrance, Caldwell constructed a stone platform 18 inches high and 6 feet long, his sleeping bunk. Underneath this stone bed, he routed a secondary horizontal flue channel connected to the main hearth chimney. Before the hot exhaust smoke escaped up the main flue, it was forced to travel sideways through the stone base beneath his bed. This meant that every time he lit a fire to cook his evening meal, he was simultaneously warming his stone mattress for the night. While settlers on the valley floor slept on straw mattresses suspended over freezing, drafty floorboards, Caldwell slept on a heated stone slab that stayed warm until dawn. Every single detail of his shelter was part of an integrated thermodynamic system. He did not rely on a giant, wood-devouring fire to blast heat into a drafty room. He created a system that captured, trapped, and stored every single unit of thermal energy generated by his wood, locking it into thousands of pounds of high-density stone. Taking each detail individually, it looked like the slow, obsessive work of an eccentric loner. Taken together, it was a masterclass in thermal engineering, a machine for capturing warmth built entirely out of materials that had been sitting in Stone Creek Valley for millions of years. December arrived, and Stone Creek Valley did not collapse or drown in groundwater, as the loudest critics had confidently predicted. Ezra Caldwell's rock-cut chamber held firm through the early frosts of the season without a single structural issue or damp draft. For a few weeks, the quiet success of his building was simply not dramatic enough to change anyone's mind. There were subtle signs, if anyone on the valley floor had bothered to pay attention. Local accounts passed down through descendants recall that Caldwell was seen gathering dry branches in the woods, far less often than his neighbors, perhaps once every 5 or 6 days, compared to the grueling daily wood-chopping routine that consumed nearly an hour of every other settler's morning. When Farmer Hollis stopped by Caldwell's claim in mid-December to return a borrowed iron wedge, he noted that the interior felt surprisingly warm, though he described it as stuffy, comparing it to a root cellar. It was a comment framed less as praise and more as quiet, reluctant confusion. After all, a root cellar was the one place in the valley that everyone agreed stayed above freezing without a fire burning inside it. Hollis left that afternoon still convinced that Caldwell had simply built a tiny, dark hole that was easy to warm, and that comparing it to a real wooden home was absurd. Meanwhile, conditions inside the valley's traditional log cabins were quietly deteriorating in ways that families had learned to accept as normal winter suffering. Frost crept across the inside of log walls most mornings, growing thick enough in the corners to scrape off into hand-sized piles. Families increasingly abandoned their back sleeping rooms entirely, consolidating their beds into the main living room near the stone hearth to conserve warmth. It was a practical necessity, but it meant that entire households were living, cooking, sleeping, and shivering within feet of one another for months on end. Wood piles shrank at an alarming rate. As temperatures dipped further, families grew anxious that the timber reserves they had cut during the autumn would not stretch through until the April thaw. Yet no one considered this an emergency. It was simply winter in the high Rockies, as woodle season they had always endured, with the same physical hardships accepted as the price of mountain life. Ezra Caldwell's chamber, quietly holding its warmth on a fraction, without a true crisis, without weather severe enough to expose the massive gap between his design and theirs, the valley had no reason to question what he already believed. That test was already forming nearly 200 miles to the west, where meteorological notes from the era describe an unusually deep Arctic high-pressure system building over the high mountain ranges. It was the kind of massive storm system that mountain elders talk about for generations when describing the worst blizzard in living memory. It struck Stone Creek Valley on the second week of December. The sky changed first. Local journal entries describe a flat, iron-gray ceiling of cloud rolling in from the northwest on the morning of the storm's arrival. It was the kind of heavy, dark sky that experienced mountain settlers recognized immediately without needing to speak a word. By noon, the wind had shifted to a steady, grinding howl through the canyon pass. By nightfall, snow was falling so densely that the valley's single wagon trail was completely buried within hours. It did not stop falling for 9 straight days. By the second morning of the storm, the thermometer hanging outside the trading post read 8 degrees above zero before sunrise. By the fourth morning, local records placed the temperature at 20 degrees below zero, accompanied by gale-force winds strong enough to drive snow horizontally and reduce visibility to less than 5 feet. The mountain pass connecting Stone Creek to the nearest town was completely blocked by snowdrifts that reached higher than a horse's back. Whatever supply line or mail delivery the valley relied on ceased to exist. The 11 families spread across the valley floor were trapped, cut off from the outside world, and locked in a terrifying battle of endurance. As the blizzard raged on, wood piles that had seemed huge in November shrank to nothing by day 5. Several households were forced to make desperate choices, chopping up heavy oak tables, wooden chairs, and pine barn fence rails just to keep their fires burning. The frost that had crept along the inside log walls in November now turned into a solid, thickening sheet of blue ice by day 6. In more than one cabin, water left in a tin basin on a table near the hearth froze solid overnight, while the family slept under 3 layers of wool quilts. Livestock suffered horribly. Draft horses and dairy cows trapped in drafty timber barns succumbed to the extreme cold, representing a devastating financial and emotional blow to families already stretched to the limit. Children developed painful chilblains on their fingers and toes from the persistent, damp cold inside homes that could no longer trap heat. By the 7th day of the blizzard, with the wind roaring like a freight train and no end in sight, multiple families began to quietly wonder if they would survive to see the end of the week. High up on the eastern cliff face, the reality was completely different. Ezra Caldwell's rock-cut chamber, protected from the gale by solid sandstone walls on 3 sides, experienced almost none of the storm's physical violence. The screaming wind that tore at log roofs below found nothing to grab onto on the smooth vertical stone face of the mountain. The freezing air that crept through every gap in the clay chinking of traditional cabins had to pass through several feet of dense, solid sandstone before it could influence Caldwell's living space. That sandstone had spent the entire autumn absorbing heat, and it was now slowly, steadily radiating that thermal energy back into his room. It took until the 7th night of the blizzard for anyone on the valley floor to realize what was happening high above them. That night, with his own firewood supply reduced to a few damp sticks, his hearth fire sputtering out, and his youngest daughter showing symptoms of severe cold exposure, Hollis made a choice. The same farmer who had publicly claimed that Caldwell was digging his own grave decided to put his pride in his pocket and walk into the storm. He wrapped his shivering daughter in a heavy buffalo robe, stepped out into the waist-deep drifts, and began the brutal quarter-mile trek toward the eastern cliff face. It was a short distance in physical feet, but a massive journey in human pride. When Hollis finally reached the heavy oak door of Caldwell's shelter, he was half frozen, his beard encrusted with icicles, expecting nothing more than a corner near a fire to keep his child alive until morning. He knocked frantically on the heavy wood door. When the door opened and Hollis stumbled across the threshold, what he experienced was almost disorienting. He did not step into a smoky, drafty room with a roaring fire. He stepped into a space that felt steadily, completely, and effortlessly warm. The air inside was clean, dry, and comfortable. There was no gale howling through wall cracks, no ice on the floorboards, and no thick cloud of pine smoke stinging his eyes. The physical data from that night tells a remarkable story. While the outside air temperature hovered at 25 degrees below zero with wind chills reaching -50, the sandstone rear wall of Caldwell's chamber held a surface temperature of roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That massive wall was being fed continuously by energy that the stone had absorbed during the sunny days of autumn and early winter, releasing it hour after hour without requiring a single extra log to be thrown into the firebox. Across the 9 days of the blizzard, the 11 traditional households in the valley burned through an estimated 35 to 40 cords of wood supplies, meant to last until spring, consumed in little more than a week. Ezra Caldwell's chamber consumed less than 3 cords of wood during the exact same period. His small evening fires were built not to blast heat into a cold room, but simply to top off the thermal bank already stored inside the rock. Hollis and his daughter stayed inside the cliff chamber for 3 days, until the storm finally broke. In accounts passed down to his descendants, Hollis described sitting on the heated stone bench along the north wall and feeling the deep, radiant warmth penetrate his frozen joints without pain. He looked at the stonemason sitting quietly in his chair and finally asked the question that the entire valley should have asked months earlier. Why stone? Why build into a cliff wall? Ezra Caldwell looked at the farmer and offered a simple 8-word response. The mountain had already solved this problem, Hollis. I was simply willing to listen to it. When the sun finally broke through the gray clouds on the 9th morning, Stone Creek Valley emerged battered, exhausted, and frostbitten. Families had lost livestock, burned their furniture, and depleted their wood reserves. But every human being had survived. And the structure that had been ridiculed as a madman's hole, a dark cave, and an unholy pit had quietly proven to be the only home in the valley that the historic blizzard could not touch. The final verdict was not delivered through a formal apology from the settlers. It was written in the undeniable visual contrast between a thin, steady column of smoke rising peacefully from the cliff face and 11 frozen log cabins sitting in the snow with empty wood boxes. Spring arrived slowly in Stone Creek Valley that year, as it always did at 8,200 feet. Patches of brown earth appeared on south-facing slopes weeks before the snowdrifts melted from the canyon floor. Alongside the snow, something else thawed in the valley, the rigid pride of the settlers. Hollis became the most vocal advocate for Caldwell's design. He told the story of his 3 nights inside the rock chamber to anyone who would listen, describing what it felt like to walk out of 25 below zero winds into a room that held 70 degrees without a roaring fire. He described his daughter sleeping peacefully on a warm stone bench, and he admitted openly that he had been completely wrong about Ezra Caldwell. The shift in community attitude was quiet but permanent. Respect replaced ridicule. Settlers began stopping by Caldwell's claim not to mock him, but to ask questions, examine his masonry joints, and learn the physics behind heat retention. By the following autumn, local records indicate that at least 3 families in Stone Creek incorporated elements of Caldwell's design into their own homesteads. One family rebuilt their timber cabin against an exposed rock outcrop, turning the stone into their rear interior wall. Another family constructed a stone masonry heater lined with an underbed flue channel. Others began mixing wood ash into their clay chinking after Caldwell freely shared his mortar recipe. What the valley came to understand, and what modern off-grid builders continue to study today, is that Ezra Caldwell had not invented anything brand new. The principle of using earth and high-density stone to capture, store, and radiate heat had been practiced for thousands of years by indigenous peoples across the globe, from earth-sheltered pit houses in North America to heavy masonry heaters in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Caldwell had simply refused to abandon ancient physical wisdom in favor of modern frontier habits. He recognized that wood was a temporary fuel, but dense stone was a permanent energy bank. His rock-cut chamber remained standing for decades after that historic storm, long after the original log cabins in Stone Creek Valley had rotted away, burned down, or been torn down by later generations. Stone does not rot, it does not flex in the wind, and it does not require replacing every generation. It simply sits in place, performing the job it was built to do long after the man who shaped it has passed away. There is a powerful lesson in the story of Ezra Caldwell for anyone living in the 21st century. Modern homes, despite central heating and advanced insulation, are often built on a fragile assumption that heat must be constantly generated by burning fuel or consuming electricity to exist at all. Turn off the furnace in a modern home during a winter power outage, and the indoor temperature drops rapidly within hours, much like those 19th century log cabins in Stone Creek Valley. The building itself stores almost nothing. It relies on a continuous input of energy to maintain comfort. The foundational principle Caldwell demonstrated, using thermal mass to capture energy, buffer temperature swings, and reduce fuel consumption, remains one of the most effective concepts in sustainable architecture. From passive solar design and trombe walls to earth-bermed homes and rocket mass heaters, the physics remain identical to the stone wall on that Montana cliff face. Matter that holds heat is infinitely more valuable, hour for hour, than matter that simply burns up and lets energy escape into the sky. Ezra Caldwell proved that survival is not about fighting against nature with brute force and endless labor. It is about having the humility to observe how the natural world manages energy and building your life in harmony with those physical laws. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, historical reconstructions, while the building techniques, thermodynamic concepts, and structural principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current local building codes, safety guidelines, and applicable regulations.